September.
Yes.
Just had to stop at some stage.
So, would you like to tell me what you have experienced here and what you talked about?
Yeah. Today I've been talking about my latest book, which is called Franklin, and it's a study of the career of Captain Sir John Franklin, the Polar Navigator. And the object of the book and of the talk was to change the way people think about one of the grand Victorian heroes, one of these rather pompous stuffed shirts who did great noble things and died willingly to complete his mission of finding the Northwest Passage. And I started this in 2004 when I was invited to take part in a television documentary which was filmed up in the Arctic at the place where the expedition collapsed and they tried to march out, and we followed their route as they marched overland towards the mainland, and they all died. And while we were filming this, like any good contributor, I'd read all the books that I'd get my hands on, and they all told the same story, that this was an expedition to complete the navigation from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that this was a worthwhile and sensible thing to be doing. And of course it's not, because at no stage, even today, does anybody make any money carrying things through the Northwest Passage. It's economically useless. You know, it has the same economic value as climbing Mount Everest. None. It's very interesting, and there's a lot of things you can do by doing it, but in terms of making a profit, it's worthless. And I quickly realized that Franklin knew this and had said this in about 1827, so that they weren't doing it because they were going to find some valuable trade route. The Canadian archipelago will not be a trade route even in 20 years' time. If we go from the Atlantic to the Pacific quickly, it'll be across the North Pole route. That will be the easy one. So what were they doing there? And it very quickly became clear that the expedition was driven by very large-scale international scientific projects. This was about a global project to understand the Earth's terrestrial magnetism, how it operated, how it moved, what influence it had on navigational instruments, and whether, theoretically, you could develop a navigational system entirely driven by the Earth's internal magnetic phenomena. Franklin had been working on this since he was in his teens as a midshipman on Matthew Flinder's expedition to Australia in 1802. So he had 40 years' experience of this. He really was in this. That's why he's a Fellow of the Royal Society. That's why he's an internationally renowned scientific navigator. He was the governor of Tasmania for 7 years. He built a big magnetic observatory in the back garden of his government house as part of a global project. So in 1845, it would otherwise have been insane to send on an exploring expedition to a very hostile environment a commanding officer who was past 60 and seriously overweight. You know, the Victorians were not fools. If they wanted somebody to lead an exploring expedition from one side to the other, they'd have sent a lot less people, and they'd have sent a commanding officer who was an awful lot younger and more agile. You know, he was simply the wrong man to lead the discovery of the Northwest Passage.
So, was it just a commercial venture then?
No, the initial project. Yes, it was a television documentary, and I'd worked with the director before on another completely different program, and they were actually commissioned to make a program about the discovery of the Franklin ships.
Yes.
And they couldn't find the ships. The Canadians, who said, "Oh, we know where the ships are," they turned up and they drilled a hole in the ice, and there was nothing there. So they had to, basically ask somebody like me to make something up.
Right.
And so we just told the story and produced, I thought, quite a good documentary. But while we were making it, my assessment of what had happened began to change. And as we were traveling across the island, and then later went back and took a route through part of the passage on an icebreaker, it became increasingly clear to me that this story had been fundamentally misrepresented, and that the object of the expedition was to get to magnetic north and to conduct a 6 to 9 month period of sustained, intensive observations of the fluctuation and variation of magnetic current to fit in with something that was happening across the world. So everybody is doing this in the South Pacific, in northern Russia, in Europe, in America, everywhere, and they're doing it on the same days, at the same times, and they're doing the same things with the same instruments. They really are trying to nail this down as a big science project. This is the biggest science project of the 19th century. It's international, it's global, it's got the highest possible level of support in governments and major scientific bodies. And the fact that Franklin's in command shows that he's right at the heart of this project and has been for 20, 30 years. He is a very, very important player in this big outdoor science, which is very interesting for a navigational maritime nation like the British. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden, instead of being a doomed quest to find something useless, it's in fact a highly effective operation because they will have conducted all of those researches, they will have done all of that work, they will have written down all of those numbers, the journals will have been there, because they had plenty of time to do that. They weren't going anywhere, but that information never came home. So every single expedition that looked for Franklin replicated his work. They all did magnetic observation. Even the private one of Lady Franklin that finally solved the mystery. They all did it. If you went to the Arctic, you did magnetic research. There was no way around it. Yeah. And this was all being driven by a general at the Woolwich Academy who believed that you could solve the problems of navigation and provide predictive navigational science through terrestrial magnetism. You can't. It doesn't work. So they were chasing a dead end. Mm-hmm. And historians of science don't do dead-end history. They like lovely, logical progressions. So we've got this tremendous historical record in which the Northwest Passage is the achievement. Everybody's trying to make the Northwest Passage. And eventually it gets found. Amundsen sails through in 1904-06, and that's the end of the story. And you then connect all the previous explorers up through Amundsen's achievement, and you justify their work as stages in the evolution of this final solution. It's kind of Darwinian model, and it's just wrong. People go to the Arctic to hunt whales, to dig for gold, to do magnetic science. Only the nutters try to get through the Northwest Passage because it's not worth doing.
And you've solved this and written a book about it, which is...
Well, I've written a book about it. Whether people think I've solved it, a lot of people have already read the book and said, well, I think it's about the Northwest Passage because everybody else says it is, so, you do find some, there's an awful lot of resistance to changing the past. People think the past is fixed. And so if you change the past, you do so at your peril because people, they say, yeah, I've read this, I've seen all the evidence, I know what you're saying, and I don't want to believe it because, well, I think something else because I've always been told it was that way.
Well, thank you very much for telling me
That's been a pleasure.
About the book, and I hope you've enjoyed the visit here.
It's always a pleasure to come to North Devon.
Thank you very much.
Excellent.